The Old Testament or the New? This simple question sparked a fierce debate in the early centuries of Christianity, a debate ignited by a man named Marcion. What comes to mind when you think of the Bible, a unified story of God's interaction with humanity? Marcion challenged that very notion. The modern understanding of the Christian Bible as a single, cohesive narrative is, in part, a response to Marcion's radical proposition. This exploration delves into Marcionism, a movement that dared to reject the Old Testament and its God, arguing for a separate and superior God of the New Testament. In the early days of Christianity, the scriptures were in flux. There wasn't a universally agreed upon canon like we have today. Early Christians relied on the Jewish scriptures, which we now call the Old Testament, interpreted through the lens of their belief in Jesus as the Messiah. They also circulated various gospels and letters, many of which would eventually be excluded from the official canon. The Old Testament God, Yahweh, was seen as both creator and lawgiver, a figure of power and justice whose actions were understood as foreshadowing and preparing for the coming of Christ. Stories of creation, the flood, the covenant with Abraham, and the giving of the law at Sinai form the bedrock of early Christian understanding of God's relationship with humanity. This dynamic period of scriptural development reflects the nascent nature of the Christian faith itself. Different communities and individuals held varying interpretations of Jesus' teachings and their implications for understanding God. The process of canonization, which took centuries, was not simply a matter of selecting correct texts, but also a reflection of the evolving theological and political landscape of early Christianity. The debates and discussions surrounding which text should be included and which text should be excluded reveal the rich diversity of thought and practice within the early Christian movement. This fluidity allowed for a vibrant exploration of faith, but also contributed to the challenges of establishing a unified Christian identity in the face of both internal disagreements and external pressures. Marcion, a wealthy shipowner and teacher from the 2nd century, dramatically disrupted this understanding. He argued that the God of the Old Testament was not the same God revealed by Jesus in the New Testament. Marcion proposed that the Old Testament God, the demiurge, was a creator God, but a flawed and inferior being concerned with justice and law, but lacking true love and mercy. He saw the material world as his flawed creation and humanity as trapped within it. The true God, according to Marcion, was the God of love revealed by Jesus, a God utterly foreign to the Old Testament's narrative of judgment and retribution. This radical dualism, two distinct gods, was a direct challenge to the prevailing understanding of scriptural unity. I mean, he's just stealing from Gnosticism, so okay. Marcion's theology wasn't just a theoretical disagreement. It had profound implications for how Christians understood their faith. By rejecting the Old Testament, Marcion effectively severed Christianity's ties to its Jewish roots. He compiled his own canon, consisting of a shortened version of Luke's Gospel and 10 of Paul's letters, carefully edited to remove any perceived connections to the Old Testament God. This act of creating a new, purified scripture further emphasized the stark divide he saw between the two deities. Marcion's challenge forced the early church to grapple with fundamental questions about the nature of God, the relationship between the Old Testament and New Testaments, and the very foundations of Christian identity. His ideas, though ultimately rejected by the mainstream church, sparked intense debates and contributed to the ongoing process of defining Christian orthodoxy. To support his theological claims, Marcion created his own canon of Scripture. He rejected the entire Old Testament, arguing that it was impossible with the true message of Jesus. Instead, he included his version of the Gospel of Luke, which I've already mentioned, as well as 10 of Paul's letters. He chose Luke because it seemed to him to emphasize the love and compassion of Jesus, and he valued Paul's teachings about grace and freedom from the law. However, even these texts were edited to remove any perceived connections to the Old Testament God. This act of creating a new canon, a purified version of Scripture, directly challenged the authority and unity of the existing Christian scriptures and forced the early church to confront the question of which texts were truly authoritative. Marcion's carefully curated canon wasn't simply a different collection of writings, it represented a fundamentally different understanding of Christianity. By excising the Old Testament, he severed the connection between Jesus and the Jewish prophetic tradition, portraying Jesus as a divine messenger whose arrival was entirely unexpected and unrelated to the God of Israel. His edited versions of Luke and Paul further emphasized this disconnect, highlighting themes of divine love and liberation while downplaying any suggestion of judgment or continuity within the Old Testament. This deliberate selection and alteration of texts served to reinforce Marcion's dualistic theology and presented a stark alternative to the emerging Orthodox Christian view, which affirmed the unity of the Old and New Testaments and their shared witness to God's plan of salvation. The very act of creating a competing canon underscored the fluidity of early Christian scripture and the intense struggle to define the boundaries of Christian belief. The early church vehemently rejected Marcion's theology and his canon. The church fathers, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Hippolytus, wrote extensively against Marcionism, arguing for the unity of the Old and New Testaments. They insisted that the God of the Old Testament, while just and powerful, was also the same God of love revealed in Jesus. They interpreted the Old Testament as foreshadowing and preparing for the coming of Christ, seeing a continuous narrative of God's interaction with humanity. The Church's eventual affirmation of the Old Testament as part of the Christian Bible was, in part, a response to Marcion's challenge, solidifying the idea of a single, unified story of salvation history. This rejection of Marcionism wasn't simply about preserving tradition. It was about safeguarding the core tenets of Christian belief. By maintaining the connection to the Old Testament, the early church affirmed its continuity with the Jewish tradition and its claim to be the fulfillment of God's promises. It also underscored the belief in one God rather than two separate deities and affirmed the goodness of creation, despite the presence of suffering and imperfection. Furthermore, the inclusion of the Old Testament provided a rich tapestry of stories, laws, and prophecies that would inform Christian theology, ethics, and worship for centuries to come. The struggle against Marcionism ultimately played a crucial role in shaping the identity of Orthodox Christianity and its understanding of the relationship between divine justice and divine love. While Marcionism was ultimately condemned as heresy, it played a significant role in the development of Christian thought. His radical challenge to the unity of Scripture forced the early church to grapple with the question of which texts were authoritative and belonged in the Christian Bible. The process of defining the biblical canon, which was still ongoing in the 2nd century, was undoubtedly influenced by Marcion's challenge. While the church rejected his canon, the very act of creating it prompted a deeper reflection on the criteria for inclusion in the Christian Bible. Marcion's influence can be seen in the very Bible we hold today. Although Marcion's specific theological conclusions were rejected, his actions inadvertently spurred the church towards a more formalized process of canonization. Before Marcion, the Christian scriptures were a more fluid collection of texts, varying somewhat from community to community. The need to refute Marcion's selective and edited canon compelled church leaders to articulate more clearly which texts they considered to be divinely inspired and authoritative. This process involved not only considering the texts themselves, but also examining their theological consistency with established teachings and their widespread acceptance within the Christian communities. While it's too simplistic to say Marcion single-handedly created the biblical canon, his challenge acted as a catalyst, accelerating the process and contributing to the eventual solidification of the New Testament as we know it. Though Marcionism as a distinct movement faded, its core questions about the nature of God and the interpretation of Scripture continue to resonate. Modern theologians and biblical scholars still debate the relationship between the Old and New Testaments, exploring the different ways in which they portray God and humanity's relationship with the divine. The tension between law and grace, justice and mercy, which was central to Marcion's theology, remains a topic of ongoing discussion within Christian thought. While contemporary interpretations don't typically embrace Marcion's radical dualism, they do often acknowledge the complexities and even apparent contradictions between different parts of the Bible. Some scholars explore how these tensions can be understood not as inconsistencies, but as different facets of God's character revealed progressively throughout salvation history. Others focus on the historical and cultural context of the Old Testament, seeking to understand its laws and narratives within their original setting, rather than judging them solely through the lens of New Testament teachings. Still, others delve into the literary and symbolic dimensions of the biblical texts, looking for deeper meanings that transcend literal interpretations. In this sense, Marcion's challenge, although ultimately deemed heretical, served as a crucial impetus for ongoing theological reflection and a more nuanced understanding of the Bible's rich and multifaceted witness to God. Marcionism, with its bold rejection of the Old Testament, represents a fascinating and important chapter in the early history of Christianity. His challenge to the unity of Scripture and his concept of two distinct gods forced the early church to articulate its own understanding of the relationship between the Old and New Testaments more clearly. While his views were ultimately rejected, Marcion's influence can be seen in the development of Christian doctrine and the formation of the biblical canon. His story serves as a reminder that the interpretation of Scripture is an ongoing process shaped by diverse perspectives and theological debates. Beyond its historical significance, Marcionism offers a valuable case study in the dynamics of religious interpretations and the construction of orthodoxy. It highlights the inherent tensions that can arise between tradition and innovation, between established beliefs and new interpretations. Marcion's attempt to purify Christianity by separating it from Jewish roots reflects a recurring impulse throughout religious history, the desire to return to a perceived original or pure form of faith. His story also underscores the crucial role of power and authority in defining religious boundaries and determining which interpretations are deemed acceptable and which are labeled as heresy. By examining the rise and fall of Marcionism, we gain a deeper appreciation for the complex interplay in theological, social, and political factors that have shaped the development of Christianity and continue to influence religious discourse today.